There's always something to be scared of on the horizon. I'm Falcon, and today on gameranx, the top 10 new horror games of 2018. Number 10 is Moons of Madness, which intends to be an exploration of mental health as well as a somewhat Lovecraft-inspired sci-fi horror experience. You assume the role of an astronaut on Mars who ends up having their perception of reality bent through hallucination. Now, as a few other games have done recently, they've also shown exactly what they're doing to try not to treat mental illness in a way that degrades from what's going on, but rather attempts to inspire empathy within the player, and also doesn't work to antagonize mental illness sufferers. It plays with some conventions in an interesting aesthetic way, for instance projecting the very minimalist HUD onto the bottom of your helmet, sort of incorporating it into the game world, in which you'll be solving environmental puzzles and exploring the environment, and has a pretty distinct visual look that, like I said, does call some Lovecraft into it. Number 9 is The Inpatient, a survival horror VR game, which is actually a prequel for Until Dawn, which, if you remember, was actually a pretty damn good game. But it's not one that leads into the events of the first game. It's actually set 60 years prior to it, and you're going to have to figure out who you are exactly. It takes place in Blackwood Sanatorium, which, if you remember from the first game, and I am going to drop a spoiler here, was a place where minors were held and even experimented on while they transformed into Wendigos, which are the monsters of the game. This game is most likely pertaining to that, as it takes place in that time period, specifically near the end of it, if you catch my meaning. And while you can probably put the pieces together and understand what's going to happen in this game, it looks to be one of those things that expands the lore and assists in the world building. Plus, it's probably about people turning into monsters, which is always scary. Number 8 is The Sinking City, an investigative open world game that looks entirely unique in that it takes place in Oakmont, Massachusetts, amidst floods that could only be supernatural. You're obviously working on figuring out what's going on there, and in the meantime seeing heavy downpours, dealing with flooded streets, and otherwise taking in a world inspired by the Cthulhu mythos. Now, the developer Frogwares has also been working on the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes series for quite a while and have developed a pretty successful detective formula, so I'm rather expecting this to turn out pretty well. Number 7 is Ad Infinitum, which is a pretty unique looking World War I horror game. Where previous takes to put a world war or any kind of war game into the horror genre have mainly been shooters, you get your zombie versions of things and so to speak, this looks more along the lines of an Outlast type game. You're in the trenches and the scariest possible conditions, obviously, rain, nighttime, etc. And there's this big demon-looking monster with long claw fingers stalking you. You have to run away. Now, this does not sound like a military shooter in the least, which is to say it may have a lot more potential than other horror-styled World War I or II or any war shooters. As a horror game, a shooter isn't always actually really scary. You have a gun and can do something, whereas the Outlast-style run, hide, don't die version of a game set in the trenches of World War I, honestly, that's very intriguing. Number 6 is The Call of Cthulhu, which is directly inspired by the story The Call of Cthulhu, and this was originally going to be the game that turned into The Sinking City. The Call of Cthulhu will obviously not just be inspired by it, it'll follow the actual story a little bit closer, but it will also be somewhat of an open world investigative game, again taking place in a town in Massachusetts, as a detective investigates the deaths of a family and discovers the fact that Cthulhu is about to be revived. Honestly, I'm fairly stoked that there's more than one game like this. And I'm also excited that there's 2 games that are kind of trying to do the same thing, but will likely diverge really far from each other. So I'm pretty interested to see where this one goes as well. Number 5 is Overkill's The Walking Dead, which is a co-op 4-player FPS game, which immediately sounds a little bit like Left 4 Dead, but you have to keep in mind it's developed by Overkill, the creators of Payday, so it's probably more fair to expect an easy comparison between Walking Dead and a Payday title. It looks interesting because there's going to be skill trees, specific special abilities for each of the 4 characters, and an emphasis on teamwork. I think it looks particularly cool because it takes place in Washington, D.C., where all of these characters had lives ahead of time, and we see the actual effects of the capital of the nation falling to the dead. Number 4 is Days Gone, a third-person shooter in which you play sort of a vagabond, a drifter, a former bounty hunter who is constantly on the move. This game promises to have some truly wild moments. The horde mechanics that they've put on display when showing the game off have just shown off something totally different from basically any other zombie game we've ever seen. The game looks like it's basically designed to be an anxiety simulator, with endless hordes of enemies flying your way and no apparent path to, get the hell out. It also promises a pretty wide variety of gameplay, including stealth segments in which you actually aren't trying to run away from a massive horde of zombies, but you can also attempt to weaponize those swarms, causing distractions, killing your enemies, and generally this very well could be quite the sandboxy type game, but it seems as though it also has a narrative and a pretty rich world to take part in. Number 3 is State of Decay 2, which is a zombie survival game much closer to probably what we know as the traditional style of these games, because it is the sequel to one of the forerunners of that genre, State of Decay, but this game does a little bit more in intending to highlight co-op gameplay and sort of foster a sense of community between players. On top of that, it just otherwise looks significantly better than the original State of Decay, and seems as though it may live up to the potential of the original game, giving you a much more alive feeling world from the sounds of it. Number 2 is Scorn, what I'm gonna call an environmental lore first-person shooter, in which you're basically dropped into a totally horrific world, where everything appears to be alive, even your gun, and everything appears to possibly be a big techno-organic structure. It's intended to be both non-linear and totally surreal, and you're not supposed to get it, at least not up front. You're going to be searching for what on earth is going on, solving puzzles in every different location of the game, and in some ways kind of reminds me of the old Prey, but maybe with a little bit better gameplay. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of the sort of 90s Tool aesthetic, if that makes any sense. Talking about the band, and a lot of grindy, techno-organic shooters from that era. But this looks like it may contain some degree of depth, so hopefully the open-ended nature of it is a strength rather than a weakness. And finally, number 1 is Agony, a game that takes place in hell. You are a soul who will be surviving the torment, exercising control over other souls, and even possessing some demons. It's really a game that is taking what it is seriously from what we've seen, and is one of those games that answers the question, what if somebody put a game in hell? They've kept this game fairly wrapped up in secrecy, so it will be interested to see exactly how it plays out, but what we've seen of it is very interesting. Couple of bonus games for you. For instance, The Hunt Showdown, which is not necessarily as much of a horror game, but it is a monster hunting shooter that does look pretty cool. Then there's Allison Road, which still chasing that dream. Obviously, we would all love the PT style game to just happen, although Resident Evil 7 was a conciliatory action. It was very good. It was a very good Resident Evil, and it incorporated some of that stuff, but Allison Road has had a rocky history. We haven't actually gotten a real update since 2016, so let's just cross our fingers. It would be very cool if it actually happened. And Project White, essentially the monster simulator in which you terrorize people in a medieval setting as a glistening, gliding, horrific freak. It looks pretty sweet. What horror game are you looking forward to most in 2018? Leave us a comment, and if you enjoy this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.